Writing a book, especially a book that's deep from within, and I think most books are deep from within the author, you're really writing about yourself, or you're writing about your experiences, or things that you know about that are close to you.
At dawn, somewhere deep within the Mekong River Delta, a South Vietnamese river assault group moves against the Viet Cong. With it goes a young American Navy lieutenant. He serves in a guerrilla war of seek and destroy.
Crazy Razor is a war story. It's not fiction. It's not nonfiction. I call it a novel. It's a story of war.
At the end of July 1964, the United States Military Assistance Command reports an increase in Viet Cong forces in South Vietnam.
Crazy Razor is the story of the Vietnam War. There's two main characters. There's one from North Vietnam, basically an academic who's been told by his country to move south, to go to war. And the other one's an American naval officer who's been sent by his country to become an advisor.
To help the people of South Vietnam defend themselves against the threat of an armed communist takeover, the United States and other countries have begun a flow of economic, technical, and financial aid, a joint civilian-military effort to build a stronger nation.
I don't think there's any true fiction other than, flights of fantasy. It's something from experience or research that you truly know.
A small but dedicated South Vietnamese Navy is hard at work in an effort to deny the use of the rivers and coastal waters as supply routes for the Viet Cong. To bring knowledge of new techniques which can increase efficiency, American Navy advisors work with the Vietnamese and help in many phases of training.
I got to Vietnam in August of 1968. I went there as an advisor to the South Vietnamese Navy.
Side by side with his Vietnamese counterpart, the American advisor helps to fulfill the mission of the River Assault Group, to deny the waterways and hiding places of the Mekong Delta to the Viet Cong.
I suggest we alert the rank patrols to keep a careful eye on this area.
I've written Crazy Razor as really two stories in one. The North Vietnamese and the American, both in country in Vietnam. I follow them through training to the real full development of war, and then to the corruption. Both men do things which are unspeakable. War corrupts the two men. I've done this via interconnected chapters. I've tried to compare the environment that the two people are in as well as the training. The American undergoes training in Coronado in an air-conditioned BOQ room, Bachelor Officers' Quarters room, an air-conditioned classroom, and then goes off to various places to do weapons training, survival training, then gets on a DC-8 and flies in air-conditioned comfort to in-country. The North Vietnamese has a very different environment. He's living in a very rustic situation, very rough situation during training, and then he actually walks or hitches rides as he goes down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He's getting bombed at, he's getting shot. In country, the two have very different situations. The American has the luxury of unlimited machinery, manpower, money for all purposes. The North Vietnamese does not have that. He's living a very different situation and is trying to solve the problems of the infrastructure for the Viet Cong, problems of logistics for his efforts. There's nothing very funny about when the bullets are flying, nothing at all. But there is always humor in war. I know that doesn't sound right. There's a lot of funny give and take between soldiers and sailors. And I try to get some of that in the book. the Vietnamese comrades, while they're walking down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, are sort of kidding and stuff. One guy in particular is catching it. But you're in a place that nothing is very funny. War's not a very funny thing. I realized that college life was coming to an end. My opportunities in my mind were graduate school, professional schools, or the draft.
On land, the Allied forces fight to turn the tide of conflict from a retreating defense against guerrilla attacks to an offensive strategy designed to defeat the Viet Cong.
The draft was not very appetizing. This was 1966. Vietnam War was on, although it was still a war that was not unpopular in the United States. Most of the people I went to school with were going on to graduate school or professional schools. I was thinking about med school, but I didn't really want to be a doctor. My family had doctors in it. My brother was a physician. In retrospect, I'm sure I killed far fewer people being in the military than I would have killed as a doctor. When I started, I had no intention of staying in the Navy. I joined the Navy because, one, I was tired of going to school. I could get a commission. I was raised on World War II flicks. It looked like it would be very cool to be a naval officer, John Wayne in harm's way kind of character. I went in the Navy, found I liked it, so for the wrong reasons I made a very good career choice. And I planned to make a career out of it. And one of the jobs that I was sent to was to be an advisor in Vietnam.
With his counterparts, the base commander, he takes part in every phase of the daily routine.
Papers all okay?
And being an advisor was really interesting because it was a real cross-cultural experience. I was living with the Vietnamese.
Together they relax when time permits, discuss their work, and the small matters of personal concern which help to bridge the gap between their two widely separated worlds.
When I went over there, I had just turned 25. When I came back, I had just turned 26. Which then I felt quite old, quite mature, quite the man.
In terms of numbers, these men who ride the river assault boats are few. Their contribution is great.
The second half of my tour in Vietnam, I went from the coastal area in Vung Tau up to the upper Saigon River, northwest of Saigon. We were essentially a floating armor company, waterborne tanks, for want of a better description, personnel carriers.
A typical operation begins shortly after midnight as troops load aboard the assault boats and start upriver.
It was an exceptionally hostile area, and our job was to land troops on hostile beaches, trying to attack or capture or kill a target that was, our intelligence told us, was coming through the area. I remember being very cautious about what I wrote home so as not to worry people. You know, my mother and father never knew I was wounded until I was home. They never were aware that I was awarded medals and stuff like that. You know, I didn't want them to worry about me, which is sort of silly. You're over there. We would go in, shoot up the beach, try to suppress anybody who was keeping us from landing, drop the ramps and let the troops off.
There was resistance as the Viet Cong sought to hold up the advance, but they invariably got the worst of it. And heavy firepower always on call. The terrain was often rugged, and so was the fighting. There were casualties, but medevac was always there to take out the wounded.
And then we would usually sit there or act as a blocking force on the river and then pick up the troops either where we dropped them off or someplace else, could be days later, and take them back. I'd say more than half the time we were the ones that got ambushed on, on those kind of operations. It was very easy for the Viet Cong to get us. All they would have to do is watch us come upriver, just sit there and watch us. They didn't have to do anything because they knew we were going to come back down. They could get in place and ambush us wherever they want. We had to come down. There was no other way to get out of that area. So we were pretty well assured of getting shot at every time we came down. The memories are there. They're coming up anyways. The book let me talk about it, and it's a very cathartic process. There's strong tension between the autobiographical aspects of writing and fiction. In the course of writing Crazy Razor, my first book, there were parts where I was worried that somebody who would read the book would say, God, did Kenny do this? Did this happen to Kenny? Was Kenny this much a hero? Was Kenny this much a slime bucket? There's a lot of experience, my experience in that book, but there's a whole lot of fiction in that book. I finally decided I can't let that tension keep me from writing the book. So when you write a book and it gets published, you better be ready to deal with the questions or to ignore the questions. Maybe is a better way to describe it. I hope the reader feels this is a good story and I'm glad I read it. This is a story that's, I think, unique in that it's two stories in one, but they're interrelated. I don't think you have to look for a lot of symbolism, a lot of messages. The messages are in the grittiness of it, the conflicts in the book. The messages are in the actions of the characters and what they've done. The book has no villains. Neither one's an antagonist, neither one's a protagonist. They both fight and kill the enemy. They both fight valiantly and kill the enemy, but then they also, in the course of their missions, wind up killing civilians. And in fact, murder enters the stories from both sides. It's a book not glorifying war. It's a book with no heroes. The only real villain in the book is the war itself.